Do you want to learn how to make signs like these from start to finish using your laser? This video is going to walk you through how to do that. Before we get into the video, I do want to mention that this was actually recorded for Laser Maker Con back in the summer of 2024. So I'm actually here re-recording this intro because I'm putting this video out there for everyone else to see. It features this ghost design as well as a snowman design that I no longer have because somebody purchased him. Nobody wanted this guy though. But if you guys want to grab the design templates, I'll put them in the description as well as all of the other products and materials that you see me using. And I'll go ahead and add a little discount code in case you guys do want to pick them up. So this video is going to go over everything you need to know to make something like this. I'll show you how I design these backers in Lightburn. I will show you some of the laser in action. I will show you how I get these flawless looking sides. I will go over shaping, painting, everything you need to know. Just keep in mind that this was recorded for that conference, so even though I don't think I say anything throughout the actual tutorial process that would be specific to that, just in case I do, that's why. But if you are interested in Laser Maker Con, it should be back this summer for 2025, so definitely keep your eyes peeled for that.
I already have my backers cut out here, but I still need to cut the frames and the designs going on them. So what you use for your backer is up to you. I prefer a 1/2 inch thickness, so I cut these out of MDF because that is what I had on hand. I typically would prefer to use Baltic Birch over MDF, but I'm about out of the 1/2 inch thickness. So MDF it is. This was just from Home Depot. It's nothing special. The reason I like to use the 1/2 inch thickness is because it's just more sturdy. I think that the thicker it is, the more value it adds to the piece. I know that some lasers will not cut this thick, but my previous laser, I never really cut 1/2 inch material. So sometimes I would just take 2 pieces of material and stack it together so that I had a thicker backer. So you could do that. You could do 1/4 inch if you wanted to keep the cost down. It's really up to you. I really wouldn't go any thicker or any thinner than 1/4 inch though. The backer shapes are included with the files, but I want to quickly show you how you can make shapes like this in Lightburn in case you don't know how. I'm not going to get into how I make my designs because that would just be for a whole other video entirely, but these oval shaped backers are one way you can make a unique frame design, and you don't have to use a ton of tools. Even if you just wanted to make a simple sign with like words on it or something, I just think that these are a fun, unique way to make a creative sign. So in Lightburn, you are just going to start out with a rectangle, whatever size that you want. And if you come down here to this radius, you can round over the corners and you can play around with this number and experiment with it, but you just click the corners of your box and there you go, you've got your half oval. Or maybe you want to make a full oval and you can round over the bottom corners. And then when it comes to the frame, I just add an offset. So for the outer frame, I will usually do a 1/2 inch. And then, you could always add a inner frame. You could come back over here and do, 1/4 inch. And then you got this cool, unique little backer. Now, this pink line down here is the backer shape. So that is just this. And then we are going to stack our frame on top. So this here is my frame, and this is going to be cut from 1/4 inch material, but then it's going to be stacked on top. So make sure you don't accidentally cut it out all at once. You don't want to do that. So when I cut my ghost and my snowman out, since I want them to be 1/4 inch, I'm just going to cut them right out where I want them on the sign, because that way I can use this negative space material as a template when I'm gluing them down. Now, if I was making multiples of these, I wouldn't bother to have them lined up in here. I wouldn't waste all of this material. But since I'm just making these 2, I'm just going to do that for the sake of, now I'm not really worried about wasting the material in this case. But if I was making a bunch of these, I would be nesting them in so that I could get as much out of my material as I could. But I've got the snowman already set up over here, and I just want to point something else out really quick. So the material I'm going to be cutting him out of is a 12 by 24 inch piece. And normally I would size these so that they fit, so I can get a couple of them on here. So I wasn't thinking about that when I made these. So normally I would size these to just under 12 inches so I could get like 3 of him on here, but I wasn't thinking about that at the time. So this is the difference. Like less than an inch is the difference between getting one of these on my material or 3. So when it comes to the holidays, you know, you might want to think about how to make the most out of whatever material you're using. But I just wanted to mention that because when I was lining this up, I was like, oh, I wasn't really thinking about that, was I? Now, the last thing I want to mention about my designs here is what I've got going on down here. So normally when I make these up, I will make them how they're supposed to look. But what I like to do when I actually cut them out is create dimension by stacking the different pieces on top. So my little naked ghost over here, his little boo bag is actually going to be cut out of 1/8 of an inch material, and we're going to stack that on top. So this is my little 1/4 inch ghost. We're going to cut all of the accessories out separately, and same with my snowman here. And then my little teal lines here are just score lines so that I know where to glue. So if I zoom in here, you can see that I've got these offset a little bit inside, so that way I know to glue his carrot nose right on top of my score lines, and same with his eyes, his little hat patch, and his buttons. So the scarf I'm not worried about because I should be able to get that lined up just fine with the side of the piece that it'll be stacked on. But hopefully once I get these all cut out, maybe this will make a little bit more sense, but I did just want to explain. And you know, you have your choice of how you want to cut these. You can cut them out as all from one layer and they'll just go back together like a puzzle. You do get a little bit of the kerf from the laser beam, but I did just want to mention this while I have you in Lightburn now, just so you can see. So these are score lines because these are going to be my guidelines for where I am shaping him. But we'll just go ahead and get these guys cut out. How about? When I know I'm going to be cutting multiple pieces of the same size material, I like to make a cardboard jig. I do this by making a box the size of my material in Lightburn and cutting that out. As long as you start from the absolute coordinates, you will know every time you put your material down exactly where your design is going to cut. Just make sure you don't move anything in the machine or in Lightburn. I am showing you these cuts with the assumption that you know how to use your machine and choose your own settings, so I really don't want to spend too much time on this portion. I have a Thunder Nova 51 100 watt, and I cut the 1/4 inch material at 10 speed and 60 power, and I will be cutting the 1/8 of an inch material at 15 speed and 40 power. You're obviously going to want to adjust your settings according to your machine and the material that you decide to use. Something else I should probably mention is some of these video clips are a little bit sped up, just so you don't think that my machine is rapidly moving here. I typically like to go with a slower speed and a lower power when I can. And here's the 1/8 of an inch material. It's cutting the inside frame, and those are all of my accessories that I showed you in Lightburn, and all of this is going to be getting stacked on top. And as you saw before we got into this, I did already have my backers cut out at this point, but I just wanted to show you a couple quick clips. You can see how slow that's moving. I was able to get through the 1/2 inch MDF in one pass at 5 speed and 60 power. This was actually the first time that I cut 1/2 inch MDF on my Thunder. Now we have everything all cut out. This way you can see how each piece goes together. You can see those score lines I was talking about when I was showing you my screen, and you can see how each piece gets stacked on top. I did make a couple of very minor adjustments to both designs since you saw them on the screen, and you also might notice that my second sign there doesn't have its inside frame. I actually might use a piece of patterned acrylic for that part, but I'm going to hold off for now because I'm not quite sure yet if I want to use it. Also, for my ghost, my original plan was to engrave the letters on his boo bag, but I think I like them cut out better. But this is just a great example of how you kind of have some options here and you can decide what you like best. This next part that I'm going to focus on is up to you if you want to do this or not, but I think what makes these look nice is focusing on making these sides look good. So for example, this one here,
this frame is just stacked on top and you really can't tell from the sides. So I'm going to show you how I create this, illusion that this is a real frame. I like to start my backers by just gluing the frame right down to it. You might be questioning why I wouldn't want to paint these separately, and you might want to, but I'll explain a little bit more later on why I do it this way. For glue, I like to use both a wood glue and CA glue. When it comes to bonding two unfinished surfaces together, the strongest bond will be created with a wood glue, but the CA glue will kind of hold everything in place, prevent it from sliding around, and it will just ultimately act as a clamp. And the nice thing about this is you don't have to worry too much about seepage because we can get that all cleaned up. We've still got a paint and we've got that inside frame. And you're probably going to want to make sure you've got this lined up as close as possible, but I will show you a trick for that you may want to try as well. And if you have a pin nailer, it never hurts to throw some 1/2-inch nails in there because that way you know that everything is firmly pressed down and it's not going to move around on you while the glue dries. I'm going to show you how I use my router and flush trim bit on these. Now, you don't have to do this. I only myself started using this for these within the last year or so, but I do like the results better and I find it saves me some time sanding. This process will be different for everyone depending on their router setup, but you want to adjust your router so that top bearing of the bit is riding right along your frame. Just to show you what that will look like, you're going to want to push the piece towards the way the blade is facing. And here it is in action, and I'll tell you a little secret. I made the last minute decision to inset the frame cut by 0.02, which made it just a tiny bit smaller than the backer because I knew I was planning on doing this. So that way the whole backer gets cut perfectly flush to the frame, and I know it's going to be nice and smooth. If you opt not to do that, this same process will just clean up any areas that aren't perfectly flush to the frame. Regardless of if you decided to use the router or not, you are going to want to sand those sides smooth. I'm just using 220 grit because I don't want to over sand and distort the shape at all, but the smoother you get these sides now, the smoother they're going to be in the end. All right, we have our sides all sanded smooth, so I'm going to show you how I get these looking seamless. Now, you do have some options here. I'm going to show you the method that I have been doing, but you can always edge band. And if you're not familiar with edge banding, it's this material here, and you just use an iron, and you iron it onto the sides of your piece, and it will hide those ugly sides. So that's an option for you, but I'm going to show you what I have been doing that I think is just a little bit faster. I just go around the whole outside of the piece with some wood filler and I focus on the area where the frame meets the backer. Now, I will say if you choose to use just MDF for this rather than how I use the Baltic Birch for the top frame, it is actually easier to get these smoother, I will say, but either way, the wood filler should do a pretty good job of filling in any gaps. For how I showed you, I used my pin nailer to nail the top frame down. I will make sure to fill those holes too. Even though they're really tiny, this will make them completely invisible. Once the wood filler is dry on your sides, you're going to want to sand that smooth. The purpose of sanding this again is just to get that excess wood filler off, so we're just doing this really quick and then we're going to move on to primer. Here's what the sides look like after the wood filler has been sanded. Now we're going to prime. Now I'm going to use this white primer from Montana Colors. Normally I prefer their filler primer, but they seem to always be out of it now, so I'm settling for this. You can also use the Rust-Oleum filler primer. I feel like this is what everybody uses. It's really easy to find, so totally up to you what you want to use. I'm just giving this a nice even coat. I don't want to oversaturate. I don't want it dripping at all. Just nice even coverage so that it's no longer transparent. Now, the nice thing about that white primer is it dries really quickly. So at this point, I can kind of see any areas that might need to be touched up, that will need to be sanded smooth. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give this a light sanding anywhere that it's kind of rough. I'm going to give it another coat of the primer, and then I'm going to see what it looks like, and I might repeat that process again. And if there's any significant gaps, I will add more wood filler as well. So again, I'm going to sand this smooth, spray it again with another coat of primer, and then once that's dry, I'm going to check it out and I'll sand it smooth again, and then I will paint. So I'm going to
finish up the primer, and then I will be back to move on to the painting steps. We are ready to paint the backers. So here's what one of them looks like. They're nice and smooth, all primed and sanded. And I'm going to paint one dark green for the Snowman, and then the other one's going to be this like grayish purplish color. So I'll just go ahead and show you guys.
Although you can paint these by hand, I do recommend spray paint because that's how you're going to get the most even coverage. It's a lot more tricky getting this really smooth with a brush. When it comes to the type of spray paint, I recommend using an artist grade paint rather than something from a big box store. In addition to better results, I find them to be less temperamental and just overall easier to work with. You've probably noticed at this point that I am focusing on the sides. I do start with them and then move on to the top. I do have a Lazy Susan bearing sitting under that board in case you were wondering, so that's just another quick tip for you. So I will typically start with one good even coat like this, and then I wait about 10 minutes and I'll go back in and do a second coat. And you don't want those coats to be too heavy because then that's when you're going to start seeing drips down the sides. If you find yourself running into issues with spray paint, I recommend making sure you're shaking up the cans really good, make sure it's not too humid outside, and again, just make sure you're not going too heavy because that's when you're going to start to see bubbles, drips, you're going to have issues with it drying properly, and just things like that. I plan to paint the insides of these backers by hand, but you could just spray them all one color if you wanted to. Because I still plan to paint that part, I'm not going to bother with any clear coat just yet. I'll talk more about clear coat when I get to it, but if I was just spray painting these backers and being done with them, I would clear coat within 10 to 20 minutes of spray painting them. Now, I'm just going to let this stuff dry, and we'll come back to backers a little bit later.
Now that the spray paint on our backers is drying, I'm going to just shift the focus to shaping with the Rotary Tool. Normally, I would work on shaping my pieces in between the wood filler and the primer drying as well, but I didn't want to bounce around in here too much. Just one thing I want to say going forward at this point, now that we are really getting into the fun parts, I just really want to encourage creativity. I can show you what works best for me, but you're going to want to play around with your own techniques and practice. What works best for me might not be what you find is what works best for you. And some of this will take practice and patience. But with that said, let's just get into shaping.
One of the ways you can kind of plan ahead and avoid error when shaping with a rotary tool is to just mark with a pencil ahead of time the spots that you want to take material off of. So for example, I know I want to make it look like the scarf is around the snowman. So I want to lower those spots around the scarf so that it looks like they are behind it. This is a great way to avoid shaping the wrong spots or just over shaping in general. It can also be helpful to mark where you're going to be gluing things down on top of. If you overshape that area where the scarf is going to be glued down to, it might make it kind of awkward. So it's just good to be aware of where that scarf is going when you are going at this with the rotary tool. I kind of already marked the ghost for you, but you could always add a little bit of shading in there just in case. Before beginning, a great way to get some of the bulk off is to just go around it with your orbital sander. You could use a belt sander as well if you have one. I also just want to mention, if you don't have a rotary tool, you could still get a nice round over using just your sander if you wanted to. On to the rotary tool. I am starting off with my favorite attachment here. These are the sanding discs, and I could honestly shape all of these pieces using only the sanding discs and never switch it up. Now, unfortunately for me, I am having a really hard time sourcing these discs these days. Lucky for you guys, I have never met another maker who likes these as much as I do, so hopefully you won't share my problem, but I did want to start off showing this one because this is honestly the attachment that I use the most. I am just really struggling to find something that compares to the original product that I, really got used to using. Switch it up because, again, most people don't even like the sanding discs, and I'm trying to get used to other attachments, but any type of carbide burrs are always a great choice. This is a Saburrtooth burr, and I love using these because you don't have to stop to swap out worn out sanding attachments every couple of minutes. Plus, they will take off a lot of material fast, so they're great time savers. You can see how this one I'm using here is pretty versatile too, because you can use it to get those lines in there, you can use it on the sides to get a nice round over, and these are a great investment because the actual tool lasts so long, they really don't wear out. I will say they do leave a rougher finish, but it is pretty easy to smooth out, so overall I definitely recommend giving these a try. And these, of course, do come in different shapes and different grits. This is one of the finer grits, but you've got lots of choices when it comes to these, so that's great too. Another attachment I think is important to touch on is the sanding band attachment. A version of this will probably come in any Rotary Tool kit that you purchase, and they have various sizes and grits. One of the great things about these is that they're really good for rounding over the sides. So for simple shapes like these, they're awesome, but you can even get some details in there by using that top edge. The one thing I don't really like about these is that I do find they wear out pretty quickly, so you will have to stop frequently and switch them out. In general, I think that these are a great place to start if you are new to using a rotary tool, or like I mentioned, you can get some really good details in with them. That just takes a little bit of practice. And just to give you one more quick example, just so you can see how you can really use these to create that layered look and kind of create the illusion that some of these pieces are sitting behind some of the other ones. Just to show you a few more attachments and tricks before we move on. For example, this is a long taper burr. As you can see, it's long and skinny, so it's great for creating lines. It's great for details. And since it's so skinny, it can get into places that, some of the chunkier burrs can't. This ball nose burr here is one of the ones I use the most frequently. As you can see, it kind of shares that same shape as those sanding bands do, but it's got that round tip. So it's great for different details, it's great for rounding over, and it's great for removing a lot of material quickly. Now, the last one that I would say I probably use the most is this cylinder here, and this one is pretty much a burr version of the sanding bands. It's got those sharp edges, so you can use that to get some details in. It's great for taking a lot of material off of the edges very quickly. This is definitely one of my favorites. Now, I could go on and on about all of the various burrs for a while, but I want to show you one last tip, and I'm going to show you how I get these smooth. When doing tiny pieces, they're really hard to hold on to, so I use a piece of blue painter's tape and stick it down. Make sure it's stuck on there pretty good though, because if it goes flying, it's hard to find, but I did just want to share that quick tip with you. You can see that I've got these kind of rough lines. I will usually try to get them as smooth as I can with one of these different attachments. So for example, I will kind of take this and just go over it a few more times. But you're never going to get it completely smooth, so I will typically just take a piece of sandpaper. As you can see, this one's already been through it, but I just kind of fold it up and just get in those cracks. And I will just do this until it's completely smooth. And then with the edges and stuff, you can go around that with your orbital sander, or I've got this awesome surf prep sander, and this spongy paper is amazing. They also sell this for the orbital sanders too, so you could always just grab some of the paper if you wanted to. Now I will just go over my entire piece with this sander until it's nice and smooth. Now, I'm a big advocate of this sander. It is awesome, but I will also always preach, use what you have. You can use your orbital sander, you can sand by hand, you could use sanding blocks or sponges. Honestly, anything that you have to smooth this out will work just fine. Here they are all shaped. I did glue these two pieces of his hat together because they're going to be painted pretty much the same color, so there's no reason I couldn't glue that. I have everything else separate so they can all be painted separate. You can see I went a little lower on the ghost's eyes. You can see all of the different dimension I was pointing out earlier. So now my next step will be to prime these like I primed the backers. I am just priming the larger main pieces. I don't think it's really necessary to do the smaller ones. Again, I'm just focusing on the sides with a few even coats. This will just help cover any leftover charring from the laser and help give me even paint coverage. Once this is dry, prior to painting, I will just lightly sand any areas that look bumpy or textured with a piece of 220 grit, but then they'll be ready to paint. Now that my pieces are primed, we can get into painting them as well. Now, this is where my methods are not going to be for everyone. I like to do a base layer of spray paint and then add the details by hand. So I'll show you how I do that. I will talk about why I do that, and you can decide if you want to do that, or you can always just spray paint or just hand paint. The reason I like to both spray paint and hand paint is because I like the even coverage from spray paint, but I can get details hand painting with a brush. Now, I will say you might want to use spray paint only, and if you do, you can always shade with spray paint as well. You can save a lot of time this way too. My best advice is to just use colors that are closer together in appearance. So here you can see I've got these 3 different whites. I can use one for a base layer, one for highlights, and one for shadows. The closer in appearance these colors are, the less issues you're going to have with the paint looking spotty. I do think that there is pros and cons to this method. Shading with spray paint does take practice just like anything else does. It can be really easy to get carried away and end up with a super heavy coat of paint that is going to take forever to fully cure. Not to mention the fact that spray paint can get very expensive, especially when you are buying multiple colors in various shades. All of that said, though, I think you can get very beautiful quality results with spray paint alone. And again, it will just save you so much time. And I think that people just find it easier than hand painting. Speaking of saving time, that's another reason why I like to spray paint before I hand paint. If I were to just hand paint, I would have to do the base layers that way too. It would probably take a couple of coats and it would just be very time consuming. This way, I can just give them a couple quick sprays. I'll work on something else while they're drying, and then I can go in and get those details with the brush. I do want to mention if I am strictly spray painting for a base layer, I will usually just do one quick even coat. The ghosts were just an example of the shading that you can do with the spray paint. I normally wouldn't go that heavy if I am planning on doing a lot of hand painting, but while all of these pieces dry, I figured we could revisit the backers. We'll do the hand painting on those, and then I'll show you how I go in and get the details on these pieces here.
It's time to finish our backers. So here's what the sides look like. You can see how it no longer looks like it's a stacked frame. And I'm gonna paint these by hand. I'll show you some ways you can get some texture and some cool techniques. It's up to you if you wanna try them or not. You can obviously paint them any colors that you want to. One thing I wanna mention is when I'm painting these, on this one, for example, since remember I have got that inside frame. So I know that I don't need to paint all the way up to this edge. Now, with this one, I did decide to go with the acrylic, but it is a clear patterned acrylic. So I'm making things a little bit harder on myself with this one. But if I get a little bit too sloppy, I'll show you a trick on how I fix any errors. So we're just gonna have to see how this one goes, and this will be a little bit of an experiment for me too, but we'll just go ahead and get started.
This is a paint technique that I use fairly often, so if you are already familiar with some of my methods, then you've definitely seen me doing this before. I just start out with some paint, and then I add some plaster of Paris, and this gives it that nice, chalky, textured look. When I use this technique, I like to work right on my backer. I find that's just the best way to get the varying colors and shades in the paint. Also, remember, we are adding that inside frame, so I actually just traced that right onto the sign, so I know how far to the edge of this I want my paint to be. I am using acrylic paint here. I recommend using that, or latex paint works really well too. I just continue to repeat this process until I get to a place that I like with it. You can use different sizes of palette knives and paintbrushes and just play around with what tools gives you the look that you're going for. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this because you can of course paint your backer however you'd like, but I just feel like the snowman design is a bit simplistic and I wanted to share a fun way that you can give the backer a little bit more character. And here you can see the texture is really starting to come out. I'm just lightly going over this with some lighter shades to really make that pop. And I'll show you what the snowman is looking like on here. Obviously, we still have to finish painting him as well, but this just kind of gives you an idea of where this is going. But I'll show you a little of the ghost backer, and then we will finally get to hand painting these guys. Now on this one, I do need to be a bit more careful because as I mentioned, that pattern acrylic I chose for my inside frame is clear. The pattern is pretty busy though, so I'm not too worried about getting this perfect, but I obviously don't want it to look completely sloppy either. You might remember earlier in this, I said I would explain why I like to glue the top frame down first. To me, it just makes it so much easier to focus on the sides of the piece, and then since we'll be adding that inside frame, we don't have to worry about getting this paint job here perfect. When painting this one, I was going for a similar look to the snowman. I just did not add any plaster of Paris here because I don't want all of that texture competing with the pattern on my frame. Here's what my ghost looks like. He's looking pretty cute. I'm pretty excited about him. I will show you the snowman as well, and I have decided decided at this point that I do not like the color of this inside frame, so I am going to change that, and then I'm going to clear coat these backers, and then we will work on hand painting these guys. I'm just going to give these backers a couple light coats of this clear coat spray. I do want to go very light because I don't want this to mess up my spray paint at all, but I do want to seal in these backers prior to gluing anything on top of them. As I get into this, I do want to admit that I have always struggled when it comes to teaching my hand-painted methods. I think this is because this really isn't something where you can just follow concrete steps to achieve something specific. The best I can do when it comes to this is just show you what I do and try to offer you some tips. So as you can see here, I just kind of mixed up like a light tannish color, and I'm using that for my shadows. And you can see it's not a whole lot darker than my base color of the ghost. I just want these to be really subtle, and I want the color to tie in with the color of my backer. And I just keep repeating this process and working on this. I'll work on blending these into the base color. I'll finish up a little bit of the shadows, and then I will grab a second paintbrush with some of the lighter shades on it, and I'll work on some of the highlights. So here I'm adding some highlights to the top of his hand. I'll add some highlights to the top of his head. Then I'll work my way down and start blending these lighter shades into the shadow areas. And I really just keep repeating this process until I've got it blended to where I like it. When it comes to the brushes and the paint, I'm not super fancy. This is just craft store acrylic paint, and when I buy brushes, I just make sure to get these square flat bristles because those are going to be able to give me the smoothest results. And here, I just keep repeating the same process. I'm adding a few more highlights. I will deepen up those shadows a bit more. Then I will add more highlights, and I just keep blending them together until I've got this to a point where I am happy with it. Something else you can try if you are completely new to hand painting is rather than mixing your own colors like I did here, you could purchase multiple shades of different colors. So similar to what I said with the spray paint, the closer the colors are in appearance to each other, the easier they're going to be to blend together more seamlessly. And here I'm just finishing up this ghost by blending those brighter whites down into those shadowed areas. When I'm working on multiple pieces like this, I will typically work on them by color. So I've got all of the white paint already out here. I'm going to work on the snowman because he's the same colors as the ghost. And I just take the same approach. You can see I've got those shadows up there where the scarf is going to meet the body. And I'm adding the highlights to his belly here. As you can see, I don't have a ton of paint on my brush. I try to do this very lightly. And I don't really ever water down my paints either. Here's another tip I can offer you. Take 3 different brushes with 3 different shades of your color on them. So this is going to be my base color here. And then this one here is going to be the shadow brush. So I'm just using that one to go in and add some of the darker tones under here where I think the shadows would be. And then I'm going to switch over to my highlight brush here. And this has the lighter shades on it. And then I can use my base color again to just use this to blend these in. And I will just continue to repeat this process until I've got something that I'm happy with. And here's another quick tip for you. You might have noticed I did this with the spray paint as well. I just use a piece of blue painter's tape to hold down the smaller pieces, and this way I'm not trying to hold those with my fingers while I'm painting them. And just to quickly show you how with the scarf I'm taking the same approach as I did with the hat, starting out with a base layer there, then I'm going in with some shadows and getting those laid in, and then I will switch over to the third brush there and just add some highlights in. My best advice when it comes to this is to just keep working on it and keep practicing and just keep repeating these steps until you've got it to a point where you're happy with it. Oftentimes, even if I'm still working on painting some of the other pieces, I will spray the finished ones with the clear coat spray just like I did the backers, and when they dry, I will start to glue their smaller pieces on top of them. The only reason I really do this is because I don't want to lose these tiny pieces I've got floating around here, and if I glue them down, I know they'll be safe from here on out. And as I start to finish these, I will spray them again with the clear coat spray, and then I will move on to the official glue up onto the backers.
We have made it to the final step, but glue up. I've got my backers here, I've got my pieces here, I've got this outer cut that I talked about in the beginning that we can use to make sure our pieces are centered. I have not put my acrylic down yet because I want to make sure I'm doing that at the absolute last step. If I have to touch up anything on this, I don't want this on here for that. So I will flip you guys around, we'll glue these guys up, and we will have our finished holiday signs.
You can, of course, glue this inside frame down whenever you're ready. I probably would have done this by now had I not repainted it, but I am glad that I repainted it because I like the new shade of green better. It's up to you if you want to glue pieces together prior to gluing it down, like I did here with this snowman. Sometimes I feel like this works better because if I accidentally glue a piece out of place when I'm gluing it down, it's going to be way harder to get off the backer than it would be to just snap it apart from whatever it's glued next to. Sometimes with the textured backers, it might feel like your piece isn't glued down properly, so you can always throw some pin nails in. Sometimes I will strategically put them where I can hide them with the piece that's being glued over it, or I will fill them with wood filler and just touch up the paint. And as you can see, I have been using Q-tips to spread the glue. This helps me avoid any seepage, or if I do get a little bit seeping out, I can just clean it up with the Q-tips. And here is our final piece to our snowman, and we can move on to the ghost and finish these guys up. This time I'm using a pencil to mark where my ghost is going to go because I glued his bag on top of him, so I wouldn't have been able to pull the template back off since that bag hangs off of the ghost. So I'm just gluing him down as one big solid piece.
This final step is kind of a do at your own risk. I will typically give it one final coat of this clear coat spray. Now, I say that it could be kind of risky because sometimes spray paint can wrinkle. Sometimes if it's really humid, this can cause a haze on your signs. But almost always I have some visible glue or something that I really want this to touch up. So usually I will do it, but just keep in mind that you need to go really light with the coats and just be really careful because you don't want to end up regretting it, but I feel like I'm safe to do it at this time.
I try to hold the can a little bit further from the sign, and I just do a couple light coats focusing on any areas where I can see any minor imperfections. And for that final step to my ghost, just adding the acrylic border that I cut out. I used the 3M tape on the back so I don't have to use any glue or anything like that. I don't use acrylic a ton, but I do think it makes for a fun option for this, and I love the way that this turned out. I will, of course, make sure that that is stuck down really well, but aside from that, he is all finished up and looking pretty cute.
Here's that ghost sign all finished up. Like I said, I don't have the snowman anymore, but I'll show you guys a picture of him, but they came out pretty cute. And I am popping back in to re-record an outro because the original one was specific to the conference. But again, if you are interested in that conference, I believe Laser MakerCon 2025 should be somewhere in late June. And hopefully you found this video helpful. Like I said in the beginning, everything is linked below. So if you want to grab the templates, if you want to grab any of the products, they are all down there. And if you are interested in a Thunder laser, I have a couple of other videos specifically on this machine. So check those out if that is something that you want to see as well. Thanks again, you guys, and I will see you next time.